Next up, though, we are in for a real treat. A couple of friends of mine and absolutely incredible vegan animal rights activists. That vegan couple, Natasha and Luca. They are social media influencers and animal rights activists. They have over 23 million views on their YouTube channel and millions more on Instagram and Facebook. They've reached tens of millions of people. Absolutely phenomenal efforts. We're so grateful to have them as part of the animal rights team. And I know them personally, and they are two of the most hardworking and just good-hearted people that you'll ever meet. So you are really in for an amazing treat there. They have a lot of wisdom to share. They've had a lot of experiences that they've been through. They really work so hard, and I'm really excited to hear what they've got to say. I hope you are too. Please give a warm round of applause for that vegan couple. There you go. No worries, mate. There you go. Good work, guys. Good luck, brother.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Oh, you guys.
Thank you.
Sweet.
This one?
Can you see it now?
Yeah, I think we're good.
We're almost ready.
Almost.
Good?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much, Adelaide, and thank you, James, for that very wonderful, warm introduction. Thanks, mate. So here we are giving a talk about veganism, and yet would you believe that only 8 years ago, we literally didn't even know what the word vegan was?
I remember on my 16th birthday, I had a photo taken with my dad. We were standing in the kitchen, and we were standing over a whole decorated pig. And I had a knife in one hand and a smile on my face. And that was me, sweet 16. I used to say salad and fruit were bird food. Real food for humans had to have meat. In fact, I used to work at the butcher's in a supermarket and packaged dismembered body parts.
And I used to flip burgers at McDonald's as a teenager. There's nothing I loved more than cooking up lamb chops on a barbecue. I used to pride myself on eating a whole roast chicken on my work lunch break. And all I wanted for my 30th birthday was to celebrate with a spit-roasted lamb in the backyard. We also used to wear leather, including soft-skin leather jackets made from baby deer, wool coats, suits, and thermals. We had down-filled sleeping bags, zoo memberships, and on holiday enjoyed horse and elephant riding.
We used to feel sorry for vegetarians. Imagine a life without meat. The first time I met a vegetarian was in 2008. I worked with a lovely lady who grew up on a farm, and one day we went out for lunch and I ordered a sausage roll. And she said to me, if you knew what happened to the animals for them to end up in that sausage roll, you wouldn't want to eat it. Well, I screwed up my face, I turned away and said, no, don't tell me. And I ate the sausage roll.
A few months later, we remember eating a stack of different meats on a skewer and looking at each other, laughing, saying, we're eating a whole farm. Later that same year, we were on holiday in Turkey, and we ganged up with 2 other meat eaters and mocked a teenage girl at our hostel for being vegetarian. She was eating pomegranate fruit for dinner and pouring her heart out to us about how hard it was to be vegetarian, living with her parents who didn't understand or support her.
We were devouring our lamb kebabs, saying things like we could never give up this taste, and the animals were already dead, so we might as well eat them.
Just 2 months after ganging up and mocking the vegetarian in Turkey, we went to India to live in an ashram for 3 months. And we had to eat a vegetarian diet.
The universe works in mysterious ways. So, of course, we feared that we would suffer from protein and iron deficiencies, so we loaded up on eating as much meat as we could leading up to going to the ashram.
Early on during our stay in the ashram, we recall complaining with another meat-eating couple about how we all felt lacking in energy due to the anemia we were all no doubt developing.
I so desperately missed eating animal flesh when we first went to the ashram that I remember trying to meditate one day and I had visions of dancing lamb chops and sausages going through my mind.
So obviously, we fully intended to return to eating meat at the end of our stay in the ashram. And then about halfway through our stay, something happened. One night, we were shown a film that changed our lives. For the first time ever, we learned the truth about what is done to animals for us to eat their flesh and the impact that it has on our health and the environment.
And we were shocked to our core. We weren't on social media back then, and we were heavily entrenched in meat-loving culture, and we literally had never seen or heard anything about animal agriculture before. So there we were, sitting in a hall with about 300 other people, and at the end of that film, there was a rapturous applause from the mainly vegetarian audience. Well, we just sat there bug-eyed and in shock, and then we looked at each other and dropped an F-bomb.
The strongest emotion we felt in that moment was anger, for two reasons. Number one, how could we have not known this for 28 years? And number two, now we have to change what we eat. We went back to our room that night and both knew there wasn't even a decision to make. Eating animal flesh was no longer even an option.
So when we returned home to Australia as vegetarians, of course our meat-loving families were totally shocked. And yet the only thing that separated us as vegetarians from our meat-loving family was education. But when my grandmother asked me if we still eat cheese and eggs, I said, well, yes, of course we do. We'd never be giving up those foods. We'd already given up enough, and that would be going too far. In other words, we'd done our part.
Again, a lack of education, this time about the egg and dairy industries, kept us ignorant to the truth and kept us consumers of violence. Because we weren't on social media back then, we didn't know that day-old baby male chicks are considered useless to the egg industry, including free-range, cage-free, organic and higher welfare, and so they're either ground up alive in an industrial macerator or gassed to death or thrown away in garbage bags to suffocate.
We didn't know that newborn baby calves are taken away from their mothers soon after birth so that humans can still her milk, and the baby males are either killed within a few days or raised for veal and killed within 16 to 20 weeks.
We didn't know that egg-laying hens and milk-producing mother cows are all slaughtered for their flesh anyway once the production of their secretions declines and they're no longer making enough money for the industries and not worth keeping alive.
It wasn't until August the 26th, 2011, when we watched Gary Yourofsky's Best Speech You'll Ever Hear video on YouTube, that we learned how violent the egg and dairy industries are, and that we were still contributing to the misery and slaughter of billions of animals as vegetarians.
You see, we went vegetarian because we didn't want to needlessly kill or exploit animals. So in order to remain morally consistent, we had to be vegan.
After watching that eye-opening speech on YouTube, again, there wasn't even a decision to make. We both knew that eating any animal products and using and exploiting animals in any way was no longer even an option. We were now vegan.
Being vegan and not participating in the needless exploitation of and violence towards animals is a great first step in a society where eating, wearing and using animals is considered normal, natural and necessary.
And yet, being vegan is not the most we can do, it's the least we can do. Because actively raising awareness and trying to stop the exploitation and violence in some way is what the victims need.
If we think about it, if Gary Yourofsky was just vegan in his private life and never went to universities around the United States giving his speech to students, that video would never have been made and he would never have helped so many people like us go vegan.
We're only vegan because he was active. And this is something we want to talk about today, why and how to be an active vegan.
Let's start with the why. If we saw someone needlessly beating a dog, it wouldn't be enough to just not join the person in beating the dog. We would think it's necessary to take some form of action to try to stop the person beating the dog. So, in order to remain morally consistent, taking action to stop the needless exploitation of and violence towards other animals must also be the right thing to do.
To take this example of the dog one step further, if I was the victim, If someone dominated my life, exploited and mutilated my body, and intended to slit my throat and chop my head off, would I be satisfied with people simply not joining in the exploitation and the violence? Or would I want people to speak up and try to stop the exploitation and the violence? What would you want if you were the victim?
When we put ourselves in the position of the victim, it's very easy to see why being an activist is so important. And if we think about it, almost no one who is vegan would have become vegan if it weren't for another vegan taking some form of action. The challenge still remains, however, to get more vegans to become activists. We've noticed that the aversion many vegans have to becoming activists is as strong as the aversion many non-vegans have to becoming vegan.
Perhaps the best example of this is animal rights activists being blocked from vegan Facebook groups for posting animal rights activism content.
In our opinion, the root cause of this aversion is a fear of judgment by others. Many not active vegans fear judgment from non-vegans, and they don't want to be seen as pushy, annoying, militant, preachy, extreme vegans.
We remind not active vegans that they already demonstrated the courage to withstand judgment from non-vegans when they went vegan, and therefore all they have to do is draw on that very same courage to become an activist.
We also remind not active vegans that just as every vegan will tell you that going vegan is the best thing they ever did and they only wish they'd done it sooner, every activist will tell you that becoming an activist is the best thing they ever did and they only wish they'd done it sooner.
As Albert Einstein said, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. And all vegans have the privilege to know the truth about how animals are exploited. Therefore, we all have a duty to act.
History has shown us that veganism alone will not be enough to achieve animal rights. Human slavery was not abolished by some members of society simply not owning slaves. It took action by abolitionists.
Women's rights were not won by some members of society simply not being sexist. It took action by women's rights activists.
Civil rights were not won by some members of society simply not being racist. It took action by civil rights activists.
The gay rights that have been won were not won by some members of society simply not being heterosexist. It took action by gay rights activists.
Similarly, animal rights will not be won by some members of society simply not being speciesist or simply being vegan and no longer participating in the needless exploitation of and violence towards animals. It's going to take action by animal rights activists.
The path to animal liberation is a long one, and it is far from over. We cannot get comfortable just because we have our local supermarkets and restaurants have more vegan options. These are great, but they are not indications that animal liberation is near.
The battle is not to make life easier for vegans by having more plant food choices available. The battle is about liberating non-human animals from a tyrannical system of oppression and violence by enacting animal rights into legislation. Now, there are so many ways that we can advocate for animals, and we always encourage people to start by simply thinking about how they can utilise their skills, interests and passions in any way that they can.
Some examples of things and jobs people have utilised to advocate for animals include documentaries, books, magazines, speeches, and translating all of those things, websites, apps, podcasts, social media, virtual summits, conferences, festivals, forums, music, art, dance, event planning, holiday tours, food trucks, cafes, restaurants, meal delivery services, etc. There are vegan doctors, nutritionists, psychologists, politicians, and lawyers. School and university students can write essays, give presentations, and have debates on veganism and animal rights, and organise screenings of vegan and animal rights documentaries, and invite guest speakers. Another example is to become a Challenge 22 mentor to help other people transition to vegan.
We can also help animals and the movement by sponsoring rescued animals at sanctuaries and supporting crowdfunding campaigns for new vegan and animal rights documentary films, TVs for outreach groups to show animal exploitation footage to the public, and covering the costs of mass actions and resultant fines and legal fees for activists, just to give some examples.
You could also consider volunteering your time and your skills to animal rights organisations or events like conferences, forums and festivals, or to individual activists whose work you would like to support. For example, if you're a website designer or a graphic designer, or you have skills in planning events or creating spreadsheets or balancing accounts, these kind of services are always needed in the movement.
Just in the 8 years we've been vegan, we've noticed huge changes in the animal rights movement. Most importantly, the time between someone becoming vegan and then becoming an animal rights activist is getting less and less.
And that's because social media has popularised and normalised activism to such a degree that being vegan and being active is becoming more and more synonymous.
In fact, as social media influencers, we see our role as not only to normalise veganism, but perhaps more importantly, to normalise activism. Participation in animal rights activism has experienced exponential growth in recent years, driven primarily by social media and spearheaded by 3 worldwide grassroots animal rights organisations: Anonymous for the Voiceless, the Save Movement, and Direct Action Everywhere, or DXE.
Of course, there are many other groups around the world doing similar activism. However, these 3 organisations have been the most successful in terms of global participation.
Anonymous for the Voiceless has popularised Cube of Truth style demonstrations involving showing animal exploitation footage in public and outreaching non-vegans on the street. In addition to helping so many people learn the truth about animal exploitation and helping them move towards veganism, we think cubes play 2 more significant roles in this movement.
Firstly, the role of the cube holding the screens or the signs in the cube has provided a perfect, accessible entry point into activism for many first-time activists. And that's because when you're in the cube, you're wearing the mask. So people are anonymous, which is wonderful for anybody feeling self-conscious or shy or anxious. They want to get involved somehow, but they don't want to have those interactions yet. Joining the cube is a perfect starting point.
Secondly, cubes have helped to normalise street activism for vegans, and as a result, they have helped to boost participation in other more intense forms of activism like disruptions and civil disobedience, which are required in order to bring about social change.
Regarding the Save movement, footage that is documented at vigils and shared on social media has 2 benefits that we think are particularly important.
Firstly, not only are non-vegans seeing the truth about what happens to animals, but they're also seeing people all around the world who are so serious about animal rights that they're prepared to spend their time standing outside slaughterhouses, and sometimes in blazing hot sun, pouring rain, or freezing snow. And that resolve no doubt forces non-vegans to acknowledge that animal rights is an issue and to consider their own position on the issue.
Secondly, vigil footage is sometimes referred to as the sweet spot. And what we mean by this is that footage from vigils is bad, but it's not as bad as slaughterhouse footage. It's right in the middle, or that sweet spot.
Seeing the animals scratched, wounded, lame, suffering, defeated, and even dead can be bad enough to get the attention of non-vegans, perhaps hold them to watch the footage for a little longer, and even connect to some compassion. And yet it's not as bad as slaughterhouse footage with all the blood and intense violence that often causes many non-vegans to look away.
Now, although all kinds of activism are important and have a role in the animal rights movement, as we've discussed, history is telling us that non-violent direct action is crucial in order for a movement to be successful.
No matter how many great outreaches the movement has, or no matter how many people take videos of animals at a vigil, there is a science to creating social change, and history has shown us that non-violent direct action is needed.
Harvard political scientist Erica Chenoweth's research on hundreds of previous social justice movements over roughly the last 100 years revealed what she called the rule of 3.5%, whereby whenever 3.5% of a population were engaged in sustained non-violent direct action, that movement won every single time.
Now, statistics vary widely, and yet, for argument's sake, around 3.5%, give or take, of countries like Israel, the UK, Australia, the US, and Germany are already vegan. However, none of them are vegan nations yet because not all of the 3.5% of their respective vegan populations are engaged in sustained, non-violent direct action.
In fact, it's estimated that only around 1% of all vegans are activists, and even less than 1% are engaged in sustained non-violent direct action. The solution to this would be for every single person here to make sure they are active for animals and, more specifically, involved in non-violent direct action, and to encourage and inspire other people to also take part in non-violent direct action. Because if vegans don't take direct action for animals, then who will?
Many years ago, when we first saw a steakhouse disruption on social media, we turned to each other and we said, is this effective, or is this actually counterproductive and hurting the movement? And we said to each other at the time, we would never get involved in direct action.
Never, ever.
However, just as some non-vegans resist veganism due to a lack of education, as vegans, we were resisting direct action due to a lack of education. You see, we were putting ourselves in the position of the diners in the steakhouse and asking ourselves if we'd be influenced to go vegan by the disruption.
However, that is not the purpose of direct action, as we learned when we watched a YouTube video by DXC co-founder Wayne Shung called The Science of Social Change. We learned that with one-on-one conversations, we're trying to create individual change by planting seeds for someone to go vegan. With disruptions, we're not trying to create individual change by trying to get the individuals nearby the disruption to go vegan. The aim of disruptions is to create social change by forcing society's attention to the issue of animal rights and forcing a social debate about animal rights. It doesn't matter what people are saying about animal rights. We just want them to say something about animal rights. We need to force them to acknowledge the issue, to think about the issue, and to take a position on the issue.
Why is it necessary to disrupt and force the issue? Well, firstly, because people lead very busy lives. So why would they waste time questioning something that they think is normal, natural, and necessary, and is considered so by every institution in society, such as family, education, religion, government, industry, and the media? Secondly, most people would prefer to remain willfully ignorant, so they can avoid the discomfort of changing their worldview and lifestyle and continue to hide amongst the knives and the forks.
Thirdly, governments are resistant to policy change due to the billions of dollars of tax revenue they receive from these industries, which also have extremely powerful lobbies. So if we wait for people to question carnism and speciesism and governments to change the current food system themselves, the massive social change that is needed for animals and the planet simply won't happen.
In The Science of Social Change, we learned that the best scholar on the issue of disruption is Emeritus Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Cornell University, Sidney Tarot.
He's written multiple books on social movements, and in studying dozens of movements throughout human history says, because disruption spreads uncertainty and gives weak actors leverage against powerful opponents, it is the strongest weapon of social movements.
In other words, as a tiny minority of an already tiny vegan minority, animal rights activists are weak actors when compared to the immensely wealthy and powerful animal exploiting industries. And yet, disruption is like our slingshot in this David versus Goliath battle.
So not only is disruption not counterproductive, but in fact it is our strongest weapon. According to Professor Tarot, disruption works because of three main reasons.
Number one, it provides evidence of determination on behalf of the movement. From our perspective, when people see activists taking radical action for animal rights and risking ridicule, and in some cases much more for our unpopular position, they can't help but think, even if only subconsciously, that we're definitely determined. This determination can also inspire other vegans to become activists. And it lets the animal exploiting industries know that we will not stop until every animal is free.
Reason number two, it obstructs routines and forces attention to an issue. We've been routinely exploiting so many animals in so many ways for so long that they aren't even considered victims, and animal rights isn't even considered an issue. Instead of seeing these sentient beings as individuals, we have commodified them to such a degree that they are called it, things, and food.
Now, because of this, non-violent direct action is necessary to force society to see that our routine and unconscious behaviour of eating, wearing and using animals actually is an issue and that animals actually are victims.
Disruption brings to light the negative peace. Negative peace is where there is the appearance of peace, but it is at the expense of the suffering of others, in this case the animals. And there is also an absence of justice. Disruption brings to light the violence that is hidden in plain sight, but goes unquestioned or willfully ignored.
Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that the goal of non-violent direct action is that it seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatise the issue that it can no longer be ignored.
Reason number 3 why disruption works, according to Professor Tarot, is because it broadens the circle of debate beyond the marginal populations that are concerned about the issue currently.
In order to accelerate the social change we want to see, we must force the debate about animal rights not just at the individual level, but also at the societal level. As Wayne Shung says, we know we can win the debate.
How do we know we can win the debate? Because there is no moral justification for needlessly killing a sentient being who doesn't want to die.
Like many issues of oppression and injustice, the issue of animal rights is polarising. And the more we disrupt the negative piece, the more we escalate the situation, the more people will be polarised. Polarisation is central to how disruption works.
We are forcing people and governments to choose between continuing to do what they've always done, enjoyed and profited from, eating and promoting animal products, and changing a behaviour that is violent, oppressive, destructive and unjust. Polarisation is a very good thing to create. We want people and governments to take a side, because when they take a side, they are acknowledging the issue and declaring where they stand on the issue.
If people and governments refuse to change their diets and the food system, then they are saying we support injustice against animals and the planet. For how long do we think that will be socially acceptable? For how long do we think we will collectively allow for willful ignorance, apathy, inactivity and injustice to continue?
It won't be for very long, because it can't be for very long, because according to the world's leading climate scientists, we're running out of time. And for the animals, it's never the right time for them to be exploited and killed. So immediate action to change is required now.
The key to direct action is to remain non-violent. Based on Erica Chenoweth's research, movements which have used non-violent direct action have been twice as successful as movements which have used violence.
If we want to gain the participation of more vegans and win the hearts and minds of the undecided majority, then we need to create a movement that people will want to support and be part of. And the majority of people are not interested in joining or are not able to join a violent movement.
Earlier this year, we attended the Animal Liberation Conference, or ALC, in Berkeley, California. And we had the honour of listening to Dr. Bernard Lafayette, who worked closely with Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement.
Dr. Lafayette spoke about the civil rights activists being trained not only in non-violence, but also in non-reaction.
When activists part of the sit-ins during the civil rights movement were taunted, verbally and physically abused by racist mobs, they did not react. After having food thrown at them, being pulled off their chairs, punched and kicked, they picked themselves up off the ground and sat back on their seats and continued the sit-in. They continued to non-violently disrupt the negative piece.
So that when onlookers witnessed the situation, it was very clear who the oppressors were and who the victims were. Sacrifice and political jiu-jitsu, the tactic of using your opponent's force and repression against them, are needed to win the hearts and minds and the empathy of the undecided majority. And we need to apply this to the animal rights movement.
Of course, we the activists are not the victims, the animals are. And yet we are advocating for them. And so we want the majority of onlookers to witness a non-violent movement defending animals and standing up against injustice despite any violent opposition that comes our way.
We know it's harder to hold back than it is to react or use force. We must be tactical in our strategy. We must put the animals over our egos and make a personal sacrifice by remaining non-violent in the face of repression.
So, is it just us getting excited about direct action, or are other people also getting involved? Well, for the last 2 years, we've been doing activism tours across the US, Canada, the UK, and wider Europe. And it's been interesting to compare our experiences and observations this year to the activism tours we did last year. The main thing that stood out for us is that so many more people are now interested in taking direct action.
Last year, in many cities, we actually struggled to find local activists who could organise a direct action. And for those cities who did organise a direct action, the attendance was really small compared to the numbers at Cubes and Vigils.
This year has been a totally different story. Not only have we been able to organise a direct action in every city we visited, but the numbers were sometimes as big or bigger than the Cube attendance.
Berlin topped the list with 110 people joining us to disrupt the meat department of a supermarket, half of whom were first-time disruptors. The action involved Luca being dragged along the supermarket floor by security guards. Then he was manhandled and forcefully dragged out of the shopping centre by his neck, and we were detained and driven home by police. It was the absolute highlight of the tour. Truly it was. And first-time disruptors got quite an experience.
Not only have the attendance numbers at direct actions increased, but we've noticed that even in our activism workshops, people seem less interested hearing about Cubes and Vigils because they've been so frequently attended and talked about for a few years now, and they all perk up with enthusiasm and curiosity when we start talking about direct action.
So for us, there's been a tangible shift in just the last 12 months. More people are ready to take direct action. And we honestly think Australian activists have played a large role in creating this shift, primarily because of the Meet the Victims or MTV direct actions. We were at the very first MTV in Queensland, and it was a powerful action for sure, but we never imagined that it would have spread like it has all over the world.
Of course, this type of direct action and civil disobedience has been done before in the animal rights movement, but there's something about MTV that really appealed to people, and it has been replicated in many countries around the world.
In our opinion, direct action, and especially MTV, has helped to create the radical flank effect in the animal rights movement, whereby when activists take part in direct action, which is perceived as radical by many, it has the potential to boost participation in relatively more moderate activism.
For example, when not active vegans see activists taking part in a direct action like locking onto a farm or blockading the kill chute in a slaughterhouse, suddenly the idea of holding a screen showing slaughterhouse footage at a Cube seems less daunting and something they can now see themselves doing.
Whereas without the relativity provided by direct action, many vegans may still have considered participating in a Cube or a vigil as too extreme. Similarly, the non-vegan public may also view Cubes and vigils as moderate activism, which they can warm to relative to the more radical direct actions. So the radical flank effect can help to normalise activism for both vegans and non-vegans. A quick example here. Earlier this year, I was outreaching at a Cube in Vancouver, Canada, and I asked a middle-aged couple from Holland if they'd ever seen footage like this before. They answered, "Oh yes, we've had Meet the Victims in our country." Having seen a direct action, which would have seemed radical to them, made the conversation with me at a Cube seem more moderate, and as a result, they were very open about discussing the issue of animal exploitation.
Again, this reminds us of what Dr. Lafayette spoke about at the ALC regarding radical flanks within movements. He said that one time when Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, Malcolm X went to visit him, and while he was in town, he gave a speech. He said to the media, referring to Martin Luther King Jr., "You better listen to him or you're going to have to deal with me." So Malcolm X provided a radical flank which made Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach seem more moderate.
However you choose to advocate for animals, we strongly recommend posting about it on social media. For over 5 years, we have chosen to use social media as our main avenue for activism. But to be honest with you, many years ago, we hated the idea of social media, and we didn't even want to get on Facebook. But two things changed our minds.
Number one, if one of the first YouTube videos we ever watched turned us vegan, then this is a very powerful tool that clearly works.
Number two, we noticed that everybody was on their devices, watching and scrolling and watching and scrolling.
And this really stood out to us because we didn't own a phone at the time. We didn't own a phone until 2013.
That's very embarrassing. But it gave us the opportunity to see what other people were doing. And as I said, all their time and energy and focus was on this thing. And so we said to each other, well, they're watching something, so we might as well get on this and they can watch us and learn about veganism. So we got on social media not because we like it, but because it works.
It's the most efficient and effective tool that we know of that directly reaches the most number of consumers and creates powerful change.
For example, you could have one personal experience as an activist, such as an outreach conversation, or perhaps you're filming some pigs on a truck, and that experience could just stay with you, or you could upload that experience online and potentially reach and influence tens or hundreds or thousands or even millions of other people.
And not only are you reaching consumers, but you're also reaching not yet active vegans and encouraging them to get active and to create and share content.
Each of us has a circle of influence, and the animals desperately need each of us to influence that circle as effectively and efficiently as we can. And social media is one of the best ways we can do this.
To attract not yet vegans to veganism, one strategy on social media can be to try to normalise veganism by being aware of the negative perceptions many not yet vegans have of vegans. One way to do this is to create Facebook and Instagram accounts with a mix of content to show people who might think otherwise that vegans are just normal people like everyone else.
For example, if 100% of your posts at the moment are of hard-hitting graphic animal rights content, then you might want to consider including some vegan food and lifestyle-related content, plus some posts about your other interests outside of veganism and animal rights, such as travel, fitness, music, or whatever it may be.
And just as we want to normalise veganism, we also want to normalise activism. So if 100% of your posts at the moment are vegan food and lifestyle related, then we encourage you to mix them up with some animal rights content, plus posts of your interests outside of veganism and animal rights.
So that when someone is scrolling through your page or following your posts in their feed over time, the mix of content they see can help to subconsciously change any negative perceptions they may have had of vegans or animal rights activists.
And keep in mind that you never know which of your posts will take off.
For example, we have uploaded many outreach videos, and yet one video in particular touched the hearts of so many people around the world. That video was called "Vegan Woman Ends Up in Meat Eater's Arms."
It was a conversation Natasha had in Portland last year with a young man named Josiah. He made the connection. They ended up hugging and crying.
That video has been viewed over 1.5 million times across several platforms. Wherever we're travelling, one of the first things people say to me is, "I saw that conversation you had with the young guy where you cried and then he cried and then I started crying."
Countless people have commented how that conversation either moved them, made them look into veganism, helped them go vegan, inspired them to get active and join Cubes, and for others, it restored their hope that people are capable of change.
I also have people telling me that when they watch that video, they do so just before a cube to get them psyched for doing outreach. So I knew that that conversation was special at the time, but I never imagined it would have got the response that it did. Now, if we didn't record that conversation and put it on social media, that magical experience would only have stayed within 2 people, instead of reaching over 1.5 million.
So, you get involved in animal rights activism, you're feeling empowered, you share the experience on social media, and then comes the hate and backlash. We understand that some people don't feel comfortable dealing with the backlash that will come when posting about animal rights activism online. So, how do you deal with online trolls and hate comments?
Welcome to our world. This is what we do. Our advice is to embrace the hate, to love the hate. And that's because the trolls and the hate comments, all that negativity, it actually helps your platform grow. And that's because social media works with algorithms, if I can get my words out. And the algorithm doesn't care if the comments love you or hate you. The algorithm just wants engagement. And that's what trolls and hate comments do. They create a whole heap of engagement. So the more engagement, that means the algorithm will favour your post, it'll share it more people will see it, and the message gets spread further and further. further. Our Facebook page would be absolutely dead without the trolls. So we just leave them all there. We don't actually delete people. We don't block people anymore. We just let them do their thing. We also don't interact with them or engage very often because A, we don't have enough time, and B, it just affects you mentally. So we just let them do their thing and we leave it out there. But they are actually helping us spread the vegan and animal rights message.
Trolls and hate comments are also a good sign that your posts are speaking strongly for the animal victims and that you're demanding serious change. You know, you're pushing the envelope, and this will, of course, stir a reaction in people. But agitation is a good thing. We want people to be agitated. Nothing changes without agitation. Without agitation, there's just stagnation and the status quo. In 1857, abolitionist Frederick Douglass said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favour freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without ploughing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters." Our job as animal rights activists is not to make friends and make everyone feel comfortable about exploiting animals, but to speak strongly for the animal victims and to demand serious change.
So taking all of this into account, we're actually concerned when we don't get any hate. Because hate messages mean you are being effective. Your message is going beyond just the vegan bubble. Sure, it's great just to have thumbs up and all the love coming your way. That makes you feel really good. But we also know that the message is only being heard by those that already agree with us. We want to reach beyond the vegan bubble. And when you do that, you need to expect that backlash. But we have to remember that we're not here to just rock the boat. We're here to sink the boat. So it's important to keep perspective. Meaningless words online from trolls and the hate messages are nothing compared to what the animals go through. They're in hell. So we need to just keep doing what needs to be done for the actual victims, the animals. Now, losing a few Facebook friends is nothing compared to animals losing their lives. Okay? And it's actually a good thing to lose some Facebook friends. That means that you have pressed a nerve. You have forced them to see the truth. You've posted something so full of truth that that person can't even look at it and feel comfortable with it. Now, they can unfriend you, but they can't unsee that truth. And that's very powerful. And you may find that people come back to you in a few weeks or months or maybe even years and say, "Remember that time you posted about bacon and I got really upset and I unfriended you? Well, I actually looked into it a little bit more and then I went vegan, so thank you." This happens all the time. So the people that unfriend you and hate you today may actually be the people who stand with you as animal rights activists tomorrow.
And if the hate gets intense, remember that the wind blows hardest the closer you get to the mountaintop. And if you ever feel overwhelmed, like we sometimes do, about the enormity of the task that we face, we find strength in the words of Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done.
And it will be done. It has to be done in our lifetime.
But it's going to take each and every one of us to step up and take action for animals the same way we would want someone fighting for our lives if we were the victims.
And each one of us can do this. We must do this.
Because as we always say, going vegan is not the most we can do.
It's the least we can do.
Thank you, Adelaide.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.